How did a young woman, declared illegitimate, imprisoned by her own sister, and surrounded by enemies, rise to become one of the most iconic rulers in history? Elizabeth Thafter's story is not just the tale of a queen, but of a nation transformed. From the smoke of religious wars and the roar of the Spanish Armada to the brilliance of Shakespeare's stage and the daring of explorers who circled the globe, her reign defined what we now call the Golden Age. This is the journey of a fragile kingdom that stood against the mightiest empire on earth, and of a queen who turned her own life into legend. The legacy of Henry VIII and Mary I, the stage upon which Elizabeth Tudor would rise, was not one of calm or certainty, but of shadows left by two towering figures, her father, Henry VIII, and her half-sister, Mary I. Their reigns had carved deep scars into the English soul, shaping the kingdom she would inherit. To understand the triumph of Elizabeth's Golden Age, one must first walk through the turbulent ruins they left behind. Henry VIII, the king who broke with Rome. Henry VIII was a monarch whose appetite for power and personal will reshaped the very foundation of England. His early reign promised stability, a young prince admired for learning and chivalry. Yet ambition and obsession soon turned him into an architect of revolution. His desperate desire for a male heir and his defiance of papal authority tore England from the heart of Catholic Christendom. The break with Rome in the 1530s was not a quiet reform, but a thunderclap across Europe. Monasteries, symbols of medieval piety and wealth, were dissolved, their treasures seized to feed the crown. Bells fell silent, libraries were destroyed, and lands that had belonged to the church for centuries were sold into the hands of ambitious nobles and merchants. It was a cultural earthquake. Henry's new Church of England was less a spiritual vision than an instrument of royal authority. The king was now supreme head of religion in his realm, a position both magnificent and perilous. In this act, he secured his dynasty's power, but planted seeds of conflict that would outlast him. England's identity fractured. Some clung to the old Catholic faith, others embraced the reforming winds of Protestantism. All, however, lived under the shadow of a monarch who ruled with iron. By the time of his death in 1547, Henry left England powerful, yet unstable. He had built a centralized monarchy, but weakened its spiritual foundation. The kingdom was richer in land, but poorer in unity. The people had tasted both reform and repression, never sure which face of religion the crown would wear next. This was the inheritance that fell upon his children. Mary was the queen who tried to turn back time. When Mary Tudor, Henry's eldest daughter, ascended the throne in 1553, she carried both determination and tragedy. A devout Catholic shaped by the humiliations of her mother, Catherine of Aragon, Mary viewed her rule as a divine mission, to restore England to the true church. To her, the break with Rome had been a national sin, one that must be washed away with faith, and if necessary, with fire. Her reign quickly earned her the name history would never let go: Bloody Mary. In less than 5 years, nearly 300 Protestants were burned at the stake. The flames licked not only at heretics' flesh but at England's collective memory. Town squares became theaters of terror, where men and women chose death over renouncing their new faith. The smoke rose like an omen over the land, imprinting itself on the nation's imagination. Mary's foreign policy deepened the bitterness. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain, the most powerful Catholic monarch of the age, was meant to strengthen her position. Instead, it made her appear a pawn of foreign interests. England, fiercely insular, resented the Spanish alliance. When the kingdom lost Calais in 1558, the last English foothold on the continent, it felt like the final humiliation of her reign. The Queen herself suffered privately as well as publicly. Twice she believed herself pregnant, only to discover the swelling was a phantom of the womb. The disappointment broke her spirit and mocked her legacy. She died without an heir, leaving England not restored to Catholic glory, but exhausted, impoverished, and divided. A kingdom on the edge. Thus, By the time Mary passed and Elizabeth inherited the throne, the kingdom was a nation adrift. Henry had made it sovereign in religion but uncertain in conscience. Mary had sought to return it to Rome, but left it scarred by persecution and mistrust. The people no longer knew what tomorrow's faith might be. Would they kneel before the host or read the Bible in English? Would they burn or be burned? This uncertainty was not merely religious, but political. Each shift in faith risked rebellion, foreign invasion, or civil war. England in 1558 was a fragile realm, battered by debt, with enemies abroad and enemies within. Yet it was also a kingdom forged in fire, its people hardened by decades of upheaval. The weight of this inheritance would fall upon Elizabeth's shoulders. Where her father had wielded iron and her sister had lit the pyres, she would need to balance steel with subtlety, power with performance. The Virgin Queen did not step onto a stage of glory, but one haunted by ghosts. The king who defied the Pope and the queen who tried to undo it. Out of their ashes, she would craft her legend. And so, when Mary's death opened the way, Elizabeth did not inherit a throne of stability, but one of peril. Yet it was in that peril that her reign and her legend would begin. Elizabeth's accession, 1558. The winter of 1558 hung heavy over England. The air carried both the chill of death and the tremor of expectation. Mary I, the Catholic queen who had sought to turn back the tide of reform, lay buried in Westminster. With her, the last flickering hope of returning England to Rome was extinguished. Into this silence, a new figure stepped forward, young, enigmatic, and burdened with the weight of a fractured realm. Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, now ascended the throne. Her accession was more than a change of ruler. It was the beginning of a gamble upon which the survival of England itself depended. She was only 25, but the years had hardened her. Born in scandal, declared illegitimate by her own father, kept under suspicion by her half-sister, Elizabeth had lived her youth like a shadow on the edge of power. Now, suddenly, the crown of a kingdom in crisis rested on her head. A moment of theater. Elizabeth understood, perhaps better than any monarch of her age, that power was as much performance as policy. On the day of her accession, she rode into London beneath skies that seemed to break open in her favor. Chroniclers speak of cheering crowds pressing against the streets, of flowers scattered at her horse's feet, of shouts of "God save the Queen," rising like a hymn. The image mattered. England had suffered under the grim weight of persecution and loss. Now they saw a young queen whose very presence promised renewal. Tall, with red gold hair that caught the light, Elizabeth cultivated the aura of majesty from the first moment. She did not speak as a conqueror, but as a sovereign chosen by Providence. "This is the Lord's doing," she declared, "and it is marvelous in our eyes." The words were scripture, but the intent was political, to convince her people that her rule was ordained by heaven, not merely born of chance. A nation in crisis. Yet behind the pageantry lay daunting realities. England in 1558 was not the confident realm that later generations would imagine. It was a kingdom scarred and staggering. The treasury was drained. Years of war and Mary's failed policies had left the crown nearly bankrupt. Famine and disease had stalked the land, thinning villages and filling churchyards. The loss of Calais, England's last continental possession, wounded national pride. Foreign powers looked upon England with suspicion, some with open hostility. Worse still, the religious question loomed like a storm cloud. The country was split down the middle. Catholics mourned Mary's passing and feared retribution, while Protestants hoped for deliverance from persecution. Each faction viewed the other not merely as rivals, but as traitors to God. One wrong move could ignite rebellion or invite foreign invasion. This was the inheritance Elizabeth accepted, a crown heavy with suspicion, a nation divided, and enemies circling like wolves. The Queen's burden. What made Elizabeth's accession extraordinary was not simply her youth, but her isolation. She had no husband, no heir, and no powerful foreign ally to shield her. A woman on the throne was still an anomaly in the 16th century, viewed by many as unnatural, even dangerous. The fates of her mother, Anne Boleyn, and her cousin, Lady Jane Grey, were grim reminders of what could befall a woman who dared to wear a crown. Yet Elizabeth possessed a weapon more subtle than armies: her intellect. She had been schooled in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, trained in history and philosophy, and sharpened by years of political survival. She had studied the failures of her father's marriages, the brutality of her sister's persecutions, and the precariousness of her own life as a suspected conspirator. Each danger had taught her patience, calculation, and the value of image. Now, wearing the crown, she would deploy those lessons with lethal precision. A new dawn. In the weeks following her accession, Elizabeth moved carefully. She did not rush to overturn Mary's Catholic policies, nor did she alienate the nobles who had prospered under her sister. Instead, she balanced. Her first council reflected moderation, bringing together men of both Catholic and Protestant sympathies. To the people, she projected a queen of unity, not vengeance. But even in these early days, hints of her vision shone through. She restored Protestant exiles to favor, signaled her intent to bring back the English Bible, and allowed preachers to speak with a freedom absent under Mary. The fires of the stake were extinguished. In their place, a cautious hope began to spread. Elizabeth's accession was thus both fragile and electrifying. Fragile, because the kingdom teetered on the brink of chaos. Electrifying, because the people sensed a new possibility. To them, she was not merely a monarch, but a symbol. Youth against decay, moderation against fanaticism, survival against despair. The first step toward a golden age. In 1558, no one could yet imagine that Elizabeth's reign would become synonymous with a golden age. What they saw was a young woman standing alone at the edge of crisis, holding together a kingdom splintered by faith, war, and debt. Yet in her poise, her words, and her very presence, Elizabeth offered something England had not known for decades: the promise of stability. The crown had passed from a king who broke with Rome to a queen who tried to undo it. Now it rested on the head of a woman who would neither retreat nor destroy, but instead transform England itself. Her accession was not the end of turmoil, but the first step in turning turmoil into triumph. That first step came swiftly, for if Elizabeth was to rule, she had to resolve the very question that had torn her father's realm, consumed her brother's reign, and nearly destroyed her sister's: the matter of religion. The Elizabethan religious settlement, 1559. When Elizabeth ascended the throne, the question of religion was not a matter of abstract theology, but of survival. England had become a battlefield of faith, torn between Catholic loyalty to Rome and the radical fervor of Protestant reformers. Her father had broken with the Pope, her brother Edward VI had advanced Protestantism, and her sister Mary had tried to burn it out with fire. Now all eyes turned to Elizabeth. Would she side with Rome, risk civil war, or stake out a new path? The Queen moved with the precision of a strategist and the intuition of an artist. She knew that to lean too far toward Protestant zeal would provoke rebellion from Catholic nobles and perhaps invite Spanish invasion. Yet to bow to Rome would betray her identity and alienate the reformers who saw her as their deliverer. She needed a settlement, not perfection, but balance. Crafting the settlement. In 1559, Elizabeth and her advisers introduced two crucial acts to Parliament: the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity. Together, they formed the skeleton of what history would call the Elizabethan religious settlement. The Act of Supremacy restored the break with Rome, declaring Elizabeth supreme governor of the Church of England. The wording was deliberate. She did not claim to be supreme head, as her father had, which might have offended those uneasy with a woman wielding spiritual authority. Instead, she chose a phrase both firm and modest, asserting sovereignty without blasphemy. The Act of Uniformity prescribed a single form of worship, centered on the revised Book of Common Prayer. Its language was carefully crafted to allow a range of interpretations. To Protestants, it was familiar and reformist. To moderate Catholics, it retained enough ceremony to feel traditional. Attendance at church was mandatory, but the enforcement was measured. This was Elizabeth's genius: to build a church broad enough to contain both sides, narrow enough to exclude extremism. It was less a theological victory than a political masterpiece. A kingdom held together by ritual. The settlement did not end division, but it set the rules of coexistence. Catholic recusants still grumbled in secret, Puritans still pressed for further reform, and preachers on both sides thundered from pulpits. Yet the fires of persecution were extinguished, replaced by the rhythms of uniform worship. The English people, weary of constant upheaval, could at last breathe in something resembling stability. Elizabeth presented herself not as a theologian, but as a guardian of order. She allowed crucifixes in her chapels, tolerated vestments that looked Catholic, yet ensured sermons were preached in English, and the Bible remained accessible to all. Hers was a church not born of purity, but of compromise, a middle way that would become the backbone of English Protestant identity. The turning point. The Elizabethan settlement was not universally loved, but it worked. It gave England breathing space, denied foreign powers the excuse of chaos, and offered her people a path between extremes. In an age when Europe was tearing itself apart in religious wars, Elizabeth's England charted a course of pragmatism. It was a fragile peace, but it was enough. Enough to bind a fractured realm. Enough to let England turn its eyes outward, toward the seas, toward empire, toward the dawning of the Golden Age. Yet Elizabeth knew that peace on paper was not enough. To secure her throne, she had to win hearts and shape how her people and her enemies saw her, strengthening the Queen's image. Elizabeth Tudor understood from the earliest days of her reign that power did not rest solely in laws or armies. In a kingdom scarred by decades of religious strife, power lived in perception, in how the monarch appeared to her people, to her court, and to the world beyond. If she could not always control events, she would control the image. The Virgin Queen. Out of this awareness was born one of the most enduring political myths of history, the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth never married, a fact that puzzled and alarmed foreign observers. For a woman, marriage was expected, almost compulsory, the means by which dynasties secured heirs and alliances. Yet Elizabeth turned what might have been seen as weakness into a weapon of majesty. By styling herself as married to her kingdom, she created a bond between sovereign and people that no foreign prince could rival. She became not a queen dependent on a husband, but a figure set apart, untouchable, consecrated. Poets likened her to Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice. Courtiers called her Gloriana, radiant and eternal. Through this cultivated symbolism, Elizabeth transformed her personal solitude into a collective strength. Portraits and pageantry. The Queen's image was not left to chance. Painters were carefully directed to depict her not as a fragile woman, but as an icon. The famous Armada portrait would later show her hand resting on a globe, her eyes fixed on destiny, England's victory over Spain painted in the background. Even earlier works, with their elaborate costumes and jeweled crowns, proclaimed power, stability, and divine favor. Court pageants amplified the illusion. At progresses through the countryside, Elizabeth appeared before her subjects like a living vision of majesty, Cities staged elaborate entertainments, actors dressed as gods, allegorical speeches praising her as the bringer of peace, rivers lit with torchlight. These spectacles reminded her subjects that their queen was not merely human, but a symbol of England itself. Words as weapons. But Elizabeth's mastery of image was not confined to art and ceremony. Her speeches, carefully crafted and dramatically delivered, carried the force of theater. At Tilbury in 1588, when the Spanish Armada threatened invasion, she would declare, "I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." It was not policy but performance, and it burned itself into national memory. Long before Tilbury, however, Elizabeth's words had already worked their magic. She spoke to Parliament with wit and authority, to ambassadors with subtlety, to her people with warmth. In every word, she shaped herself as both ruler and symbol. A sovereign of symbols. By the 1560s, Elizabeth had become more than a queen. She was the embodiment of England's identity. Her unmarried state, her carefully controlled portraits, her theatrical speeches, all these threads wove together into a tapestry of myth. She was Gloriana, Astrea, the Virgin Queen, mother of her people and defender of the realm. This was no mere vanity. In an age when monarchs could be toppled by doubt, when faith and loyalty were fragile, Elizabeth's cultivated image became the glue of national unity. The people might disagree on doctrine, suffer under taxation, or question her policies, but they believed in her. It was this belief, crafted with artistry and calculation, that transformed a vulnerable young woman into the sovereign of a golden age. But even as her image bound the realm together, it also made her a target, for those who saw not Gloriana, but a usurper to be struck down. Confronting plots and rebellion. No crown in 16th-century Europe was secure, and Elizabeth's glittering image was shadowed by conspiracies. To her enemies, she was a heretic queen, the daughter of Anne Boleyn's illicit marriage, an obstacle to be removed. To her Catholic rivals abroad and at home, every whisper of discontent, every flicker of rebellion, became a chance to unseat her. The Virgin Queen reigned not only over her people, but also over a kingdom of daggers hidden in the dark. The Rising in the North. The first great test came in 1569, when discontent in the north of England boiled into open revolt. Powerful Catholic nobles, the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland, raised their banners, calling for Elizabeth's overthrow and the restoration of the true faith. Their cause was bound to a living symbol, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth's cousin and Catholic heir to the throne. The rebellion began with solemn processions and the ringing of church bells. Masses were celebrated in defiance of the Queen's settlement. But what the rebels imagined as a crusade quickly faltered. Elizabeth's armies marched north, swift and merciless. Villages that had joined the cause were burned, and the leaders fled across the border. The revolt was crushed, yet it left a scar. Proof that Elizabeth's enemies would use Mary Stuart as their rallying cry. The web of plots. The following years unfolded like a grim play of shadows. Plot followed plot, each more dangerous than the last. The Ridolfi plot of 1571 sought to place Mary on the throne with the aid of Spanish arms. The Throckmorton plot of 1583 wove together discontented English Catholics with promises of French invasion. The Babington plot of 1586, the most infamous of all, aimed not only to depose Elizabeth, but to assassinate her outright. At the center of these conspiracies stood Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spy master. Cold, relentless, and brilliant, he built a web of informants that stretched from London taverns to the courts of Europe. Letters were intercepted, codes deciphered, secrets betrayed. In dimly lit chambers, Walsingham's agents unraveled conspiracies before they could ignite, exposing the hidden machinery of treason. The fate of Mary Stuart. Each plot tightened the noose around Mary, Queen of Scots. Imprisoned in England since 1568, she was both guest and prisoner, both royal cousin and mortal threat. Her presence was a magnet for conspiracy. Her name, a banner for rebellion. The Babington plot proved her undoing. Intercepted letters revealed her complicity, her consent to Elizabeth's assassination. The evidence was undeniable. In 1587, after years of hesitation, Elizabeth signed Mary's death warrant. The execution shocked Europe, the death of a queen by another queen's command. Yet for Elizabeth, it was not triumph, but necessity. An act to safeguard her crown, her people, and her life. Survival through shadows. Elizabeth's reign in these decades was a dance upon a knife's edge. Each conspiracy could have ended not only her rule, but the very independence of England. Yet through vigilance, cunning, and the ruthless efficiency of her ministers, she endured. The Virgin Queen, once a symbol of renewal, had now become a figure of survival. Her court was a theater of splendor, but beneath its pageantry lay the ceaseless struggle against treason. The Golden Age was not born in peace. It was hammered out in the clash of daggers and the silence of prison cells. And while daggers threatened her in the dark at home, a far greater danger loomed across the sea, where the ambitions of Spain and its king would soon test the very survival of her crown. Relations with Spain. If Elizabeth's early reign was haunted by conspiracies at home, the greater shadow soon stretched across the Channel. It was cast by the mightiest empire of the age, Spain, ruled by Philip II. Rich with the silver of the New World, disciplined in armies hardened by decades of war, and bound to the Catholic faith with uncompromising zeal, Spain represented both the glory and menace of 16th-century Europe. To Philip, Elizabeth was more than a distant rival. She was a heretic queen, an illegitimate usurper standing in defiance of Rome. To Elizabeth, Philip was both a potential partner in diplomacy and the most dangerous adversary her kingdom could face. From ally to adversary. The irony was sharp. Philip had once been Mary Tudor's husband, briefly styling himself King of England during her reign. His marriage had been meant to unite England and Spain under Catholic power, but Mary's death in 1558 dissolved the union and left Philip watching uneasily as Elizabeth, the Protestant princess, claimed the throne. At first, Philip moved cautiously. He proposed marriage to Elizabeth, a union that might have secured his influence and preserved England for Catholicism. Elizabeth, ever the mistress of ambiguity, entertained the offer but never committed. She wielded marriage as a tool, a promise never fulfilled, keeping powerful men and nations hopeful yet always uncertain. When the proposal faded, suspicion deepened. Spain remained the dominant Catholic power in Europe, and Elizabeth's England was now firmly set upon a Protestant course. Religion sharpened the rift, but it was not faith alone that drove them apart. Trade, piracy, and the scramble for empire pushed the two kingdoms into inevitable collision. The War of Commerce. The seas became the first battlefield. Spain's wealth poured across the Atlantic in great galleons heavy with gold and silver from the Americas. To England's restless mariners, these ships were not inviolable treasures of a sovereign state, but ripe targets. Men like John Hawkins and Francis Drake, half explorers and half pirates, struck at Spain's shipping with ferocity. Drake, in particular, would become a legend, the dragon who circumnavigated the globe and returned with his holds laden with plunder torn from Spain's empire. Elizabeth played a dangerous game. Officially, she disavowed piracy, presenting herself as a monarch of order and law. Privately, she rewarded her sea dogs, knighted Drake upon his return, and took a share of the spoils. To Spain, these acts were nothing less than state-sponsored robbery. Each captured treasure ship was an insult, each raid upon Spanish ports a provocation. The Atlantic became a theater of undeclared war, with England punching far above its weight through daring and audacity. The question of the Netherlands. While the seas carried one struggle, the land bore another. In the Low Countries, Spanish rule was being shaken by rebellion. Protestant Dutch provinces rose against Philip's authority, seeking independence. For Elizabeth, their cause was both political and personal. If Spain crushed the revolt, its power would grow unchecked across northern Europe, with armies poised on England's doorstep. If the Dutch succeeded, they would become allies and a buffer against Spanish might. Elizabeth hesitated, wary of provoking direct war, but her sympathies leaned toward the rebels. English money and volunteers trickled into the Netherlands, and eventually her government gave covert aid. Philip knew well where the hand of support was coming from. In his eyes, Elizabeth was no longer a cautious monarch balancing faiths, but an open enemy aiding rebellion against his crown. Diplomacy in ashes. For a time, Elizabeth still sought the dance of diplomacy. She sent envoys, made gestures of peace, and dangled marriage alliances with European princes to keep Spain uncertain. Yet these gestures were theater more than substance. Beneath them, the tide of enmity swelled. By the late 1570s and early 1580s, the mask had slipped. Drake's raids reached the very heart of Spain's empire, striking boldly at ports in the Caribbean and even singeing the King of Spain's beard at Cadiz. The audacity thrilled the English public but infuriated Philip. To him, Elizabeth was not simply tolerating piracy. She was unleashing it as national policy. A clash of worlds. Thus, the relationship between England and Spain became more than a rivalry of monarchs. It was a clash of worlds. Spain stood for Catholic orthodoxy, empire, and the wealth of the New World flowing into Europe. England, under Elizabeth, was becoming the champion of Protestant independence, a nation of merchants and sailors daring to challenge the old order. The stakes were colossal. If Spain prevailed, England could be returned to the Catholic fold, subdued under foreign dominance, and its fragile Protestant settlement crushed. If Elizabeth held her ground, England might rise from a small island kingdom to a power of global consequence. Toward the gathering storm. By the mid-1580s, relations had collapsed beyond repair. Elizabeth's execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587 was the final spark. For Philip, it was not merely an affront to royal dignity, but a declaration of war. Plans began in earnest for an invasion, a mighty fleet, an Armada Invincible that would cross the Channel, link with Spanish forces in the Netherlands, and bring Protestant England to its knees. But that story belongs to another chapter. For now, the stage was set, a Protestant queen and her island kingdom staring across the sea at the most powerful monarch in the world. The tide of history was rising, and the clash between England and Spain would determine not only the fate of a queen, but the future of Europe itself. Yet Spain was not the only force Elizabeth had to watch. Even as the Armada gathered, the shifting ambitions of France posed a different kind of danger, less direct, but no less perilous. Relations with France. If Spain was the thundercloud looming over Elizabeth's reign, France was the shifting wind, unpredictable, alluring, and dangerous. For centuries, England and France had been entwined in rivalry and war, their histories scarred by battles stretching back to the 100 Years' War. By the mid-16th century, however, their relationship had taken on a more subtle, almost theatrical quality. France was both potential partner and mortal threat, a kingdom divided within itself yet still capable of destabilizing Elizabeth's fragile realm. The weight of history. The memory of Calais haunted English pride. Once the last jewel of England's continental possessions, it had been lost under Mary Wise in 1558, a humiliation that still echoed as Elizabeth took the throne. France remained the great rival across the Channel, a Catholic power with ambitions that could easily entangle England in continental struggles. Yet, unlike Spain, whose empire spanned oceans, France's turbulence was closer, more intimate, and less predictable. Elizabeth inherited a diplomatic puzzle: how to prevent France from becoming a staging ground for her enemies while also using French rivalries to England's advantage. The dance of marriage. Elizabeth's mastery of image extended into diplomacy, and nowhere was this clearer than in her marriage negotiations with French princes. The most famous of these was her long courtship dance with François, Duke of Anjou, the brother of King Henry III of France. Short, pockmarked, and far from the romantic ideal, Anjou was nonetheless a political prize. A marriage alliance could have bound England and France against Spain, reshaping the balance of power in Europe. Elizabeth entertained the idea with theatrical skill. She allowed Anjou to believe he had captured her heart, even calling him her frog, a nickname at once affectionate and dismissive. Court masks, letters, and gestures suggested a union was possible, keeping Spain anxious and the English nobility guessing. Yet, in the end, Elizabeth never married. The flirtation was diplomacy disguised as romance, a performance designed to buy time and leverage without surrendering independence. France in flames. While Elizabeth played the stage in England, France itself was convulsed by its own turmoil. The French wars of religion erupted in the 1560s, pitting Catholics against Huguenots, French Protestants, in a brutal cycle of massacres and reprisals. The most infamous of these was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, when thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered in Paris and across the kingdom. The horror sent shockwaves through Protestant Europe. In England, it confirmed the belief that Catholic France could never be trusted. Elizabeth, though horrified, also recognized opportunity. A France divided by religion was a France too weak to threaten her directly. She offered cautious support to the Huguenots, not enough to provoke outright war, but sufficient to ensure that France remained preoccupied with its own bloodshed. A balancing act. Elizabeth's strategy toward France was one of careful balance. She could not afford outright enmity, for that would leave England encircled by hostile Catholic powers. Nor could she trust France completely, given its shifting alliances and dynastic ambitions. Instead, she maneuvered between hostility and friendship, always keeping France close enough to negotiate with but distant enough to fear her displeasure. This balancing act extended to Scotland, where French influence had long been strong through the Auld Alliance. Mary, Queen of Scots, had once been married to the French King Francis II, binding Scotland and France against England. Elizabeth's imprisonment of Mary was not only an act of survival against domestic conspiracy, but also a signal to France. England would not be drawn into submission through dynastic games. The broader chessboard. In the great chessboard of Europe, Elizabeth often used France as a counterweight to Spain. When relations with Philip II grew tense, she dangled the possibility of alliance with France. When France grew too close to Spain, she signaled sympathy for the Huguenots. The Queen's diplomacy was less about firm alliances than about perpetual motion, keeping her enemies off balance and her options open. Yet this game was dangerous. Both Catholic France and Spain saw Elizabeth as illegitimate and her religious settlement as heresy. Either power, given the chance, might have supported invasion. Elizabeth's skill lay in ensuring that France and Spain never aligned long enough to destroy her. The fragile peace. By the 1580s, France was locked in the later phases of its religious wars, torn between rival Catholic factions and the emerging Protestant leader Henry of Navarre. Elizabeth offered him cautious support, recognizing that a Protestant claimant to the French throne could be both ally and shield. Yet her involvement was measured. She would not allow England to bleed itself dry in France's endless wars. Thus, Elizabeth's relationship with France was one of perpetual tension, sometimes ally, sometimes adversary, always uncertain. Unlike the clear enmity with Spain, relations with France demanded constant improvisation. The curtain rises. By the eve of the Armada crisis, France was still mired in its own divisions. This gave Elizabeth breathing space. Spain would be her primary enemy, and France, though dangerous, remained too fractured to act decisively. Yet the threat never disappeared, At any moment, a shift in France's religious wars could have turned the kingdom into a formidable Catholic weapon against her. Elizabeth knew it, and so she continued her dance, charming, elusive, pragmatic. France was a mirror in which she projected her image of strength, a stage upon which she played for time. In that delicate balance, she ensured England's survival. But even as Elizabeth balanced France and Spain with masterful poise, the most dangerous threat lay not across the Channel, but within her own isles, embodied in the figure of Mary, Queen of Scots. The inevitable confrontation. The rivalry between Elizabeth and her enemies could be balanced and postponed, but it could not be avoided forever. Beneath the surface of diplomacy and spectacle, a deeper struggle was brewing, one that fused religion, dynastic claims, and the fate of nations. At its heart stood a woman whose very existence threatened Elizabeth's crown, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. The shadow of Mary was everything Elizabeth was not. Born legitimate, heir to the Scottish throne from infancy, she was also briefly Queen of France, as the wife of King Francis II. To Catholics across Europe, Mary was the rightful sovereign of England, descended directly from Henry VII through Margaret Tudor. Elizabeth, by contrast, was branded a bastard, the child of Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn, a union condemned by Rome. When Mary was forced to abdicate her Scottish throne and fled into England in 1568, Elizabeth found herself in an impossible position. To shelter Mary was to harbor a rival. To execute her was to risk the wrath of Catholic Europe. Elizabeth chose a middle path, imprisonment. But confinement did not silence Mary. Instead, she became a living symbol, a rallying point for every plot and rebellion that sought to unseat Elizabeth. The drumbeat of conspiracy. The Northern Rebellion of 1569 had already revealed the danger of Mary's presence. Each subsequent plot, Ridolfi, Throckmorton, Babington, returned to the same refrain. Mary on the throne, England reconciled to Rome, Protestantism crushed. For Elizabeth, these were not mere whispers but existential threats. Every letter smuggled into Mary's chambers, every cipher intercepted by Walsingham's agents, was another spark in the tinderbox. The Babington plot of 1586 brought the tension to its breaking point. Anthony Babington and his co-conspirators dreamed of Elizabeth's assassination and Mary's liberation. Their secret messages, intercepted and decoded, revealed Mary's consent to the plan. For the first time, the rival queen was directly implicated in treason. Elizabeth agonized. To kill Mary was to kill an anointed sovereign, a cousin bound by blood, a queen who might one day stand in judgment of her. Yet to let Mary live was to invite endless conspiracy. The decision hung like a sword above England's fate. The execution. On a cold February morning in 1587, the drama reached its climax. In the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, Mary Stuart, dressed in crimson, the Catholic color of martyrdom, knelt before the block. With calm dignity, she declared her faith and her innocence. The axe fell, not once but twice, severing not only her life, but a century of dynastic rivalry. The execution reverberated across Europe. To Catholics, it was an outrage, a heretical queen murdering God's anointed. To Elizabeth, it was a wound to her conscience, a decision she claimed was forced upon her ministers, though the warrant bore her signature. Yet, politically, it removed the single greatest internal threat to her reign. The rival claimant was gone. The stage was cleared for the confrontation that now loomed on the seas. Spain's fury. Philip II of Spain needed no further excuse. Already enraged by English piracy and Elizabeth's support for the Dutch revolt, he now had a martyr to rally Catholic Europe. Mary's death transformed political rivalry into holy war. Philip framed his invasion plans not merely as conquest but as crusade, the restoration of England to the Catholic faith, the punishment of the heretic queen. Elizabeth, for her part, steeled herself. The mask of pageantry gave way to the armor of defiance. She prepared her realm for invasion, raised militias, and entrusted her admirals to the seas. The queen who had once danced delicately between France and Spain now faced the full force of one of them, with no veil of ambiguity left to shield her. The march toward destiny. The confrontation was no longer a question of if, but when. The storm that Elizabeth had long tried to delay was gathering in plain sight. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, had stripped away the illusions of compromise and left only the stark reality of war. Elizabeth stood as a solitary figure against the might of an empire, her survival tied to the fate of her island kingdom. The inevitable clash with Spain, long whispered, long feared, was now unavoidable. The course of England, and perhaps of Europe, would be decided not in chambers of diplomacy or courts of intrigue, but on the open sea. And so, the storm that loomed on the horizon finally broke, its first rumblings heard in the halls of Europe as Philip II seized upon Mary's death as both pretext and prophecy for war. Causes and beginnings. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, had torn away the last veil of restraint. Europe now looked upon Elizabeth as a queen who had slain another sovereign, an act shocking even in an age of cruelty. For Philip II of Spain, it was the final justification he needed. His grievances against England had long piled up like kindling, and Mary's death was the spark that set them ablaze. The seeds of war, the roots of confrontation stretched back decades. Religion was the deepest wound. Elizabeth's settlement had made England a Protestant bulwark, defiant of Rome. Philip, champion of Catholic orthodoxy, saw her as a heretic monarch, corrupting Christendom with false doctrine. To him, restoring England to the true faith was not merely politics, but divine duty. Yet faith alone did not drive the march to war. England's privateers had gnawed at the lifelines of Spain's empire, intercepting treasure fleets, raiding Caribbean ports, even striking Cadiz itself in 1587, where Francis Drake's daring assault delayed the Spanish fleet. To Philip, these were not acts of adventurers, but provocations sanctioned by the English crown. Each galleon lost to Drake's fire was a humiliation before the world. In the Netherlands, the conflict sharpened further. Elizabeth's support for the Protestant Dutch rebels directly challenged Spanish rule. Money, soldiers, and English volunteers flowed across the Channel, and in 1585 she formally sent the Earl of Leicester to command forces in the Low Countries. Spain saw this as outright war in all but name. Philip's vision. For Philip, the invasion of England became more than revenge. It was a holy crusade, a campaign to unite Catholic Europe under his banner. The plan was audacious. A massive fleet, an armada Invincible, would cross the Channel, link with Spanish forces in the Netherlands, and deliver the Duke of Parma's veteran army onto English soil. Once ashore, they would march on London, depose Elizabeth, and restore Catholic rule. Philip believed himself an instrument of Providence. His empire spanned the globe, his armies were seasoned, his fleets mighty. To his eyes, the conquest of England was inevitable, as though God himself had signed the order. Elizabeth's defiance. In England, the threat was clear and terrifying. Spain was the greatest power of the age, its resources vast, its soldiers disciplined, its fleets formidable. Elizabeth's kingdom, by contrast, was smaller, poorer, and internally divided. Yet the queen refused to cower. She summoned her council, raised levies, and called upon her seafarers to defend the realm. Her words were not of fear, but of destiny. England, she proclaimed, would stand as an island fortress, protected by God and by the courage of her people. If Philip meant to crush her crown, he would have to do so on England's shores. The gathering storm. Thus, by 1587, the stage was set. The grievances of decades, religious division, piracy, rebellion, dynastic rivalry, had converged into a single path, Spain prepared its Armada, a fleet the world had never seen before. England braced itself, its fate tied to the winds and waves. The conflict was no longer whispers of intrigue or the clash of spies. It was open, inevitable, a storm gathering on the horizon. The greatest naval confrontation of the 16th century was about to begin, and when the storm finally broke, it took the form of sails blotting out the horizon, the Armada itself, summoned by Spain and awaited by all of Europe. The Battle of 1588. The summer of 1588 dawned heavy with expectation. Across Europe, rumors whispered of a fleet so vast it seemed to darken the horizon, a force that would bring down Elizabeth's fragile Protestant realm. In taverns and churches alike, people spoke of the Spanish Armada as though it were a juggernaut of destiny. La Armada Invincible, the Invincible Fleet. For Spain, it was to be the stroke of divine retribution. For England, it was the crucible in which its survival would be tested. The Armada sets sail. In May, Philip II's Armada gathered at Lisbon, a colossal formation of over 130 ships, galleons, galleys, supply vessels, and troop transports, carrying nearly 30,000 men. Towering above the sea, its sails billowed like a floating fortress. Painted and gilded, adorned with crucifixes and banners, it was both an army and a sermon, a proclamation of Spain's faith and power. The plan was clear. Sail north through the Channel, establish control of the seas, and rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's seasoned troops in the Netherlands. Together, the Armada and Parma's army would cross into England, sweep aside resistance, and topple Elizabeth's throne. The conquest was envisioned as swift, decisive, and inevitable. But the sea is a treacherous ally. From the beginning, storms battered the fleet, scattering ships and delaying progress. When at last the Armada reached the Channel in late July, its formation was battered, yet still formidable. The English prepare. In England, alarms spread like wildfire. Church bells rang, beacons flared from hilltops, and musters were called across the shires. The realm braced for invasion. Elizabeth's navy, though smaller in number, had been carefully prepared. Under Lord Charles Howard of Effingham, and with Sir Francis Drake as Vice Admiral, the English fleet numbered around 200 vessels, many smaller than Spain's, but faster, lighter, and armed with long-range guns. Elizabeth herself played the part of queen and symbol. At Tilbury, she addressed her assembled soldiers with words that would echo for centuries. "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." In that moment, she became more than monarch. She was England itself, defiant against the might of empire. The dance of fire in the Channel. The first clashes came in the Channel waters near Plymouth. The Spanish sailed in their crescent formation, heavy and imposing, their galleons protecting supply ships at the center. The English darted around them like wolves circling a bull, unleashing long-range cannon fire before retreating out of reach. It was a new style of warfare. Spain's strength lay in boarding actions, close combat where their infantry could overwhelm enemy decks. England, by contrast, fought at range, relying on gunnery to cripple and scatter. The Channel became a stage for this deadly ballet, smoke and thunder rolling across the waves as ships maneuvered in pursuit and retreat. Drake proved masterful in harassment. With precision, he struck at stragglers, captured supply ships, and forced the Armada to hold its defensive crescent. Night after night, the English fleet shadowed their enemy, harassing, delaying, and forcing them ever eastward. The fire at Calais. By early August, the Armada anchored at Calais, awaiting Parma's army. Yet here lay the flaw in Philip's grand design. Communication between the fleet and the land forces was crippled. Parma's army was not ready, and shallow Dutch waters, controlled by hostile rebels, prevented his troops from boarding easily. The Armada, massive and unwieldy, became a fleet in limbo, waiting under the guns of Calais. The English seized the moment. On the night of August 7th, they unleashed a weapon as old as war itself: fire. 8 ships, packed with tar, pitch, and explosives, were set ablaze and sent drifting into the anchored armada. The sight was terrifying. In the blackness of night, fiery hulls bore down upon Spain's fleet, their flames roaring, their masts collapsing in sparks. Panic erupted. Captains cut anchors to flee, colliding with one another in the darkness. The Armada's proud crescent shattered. By dawn, the Invincible fleet was scattered, its tight formation broken. The English pounced. The Battle of Gravelines. The decisive clash came off Gravelines on August 8th. With the Armada in disarray, Howard and Drake pressed their advantage. English ships surged forward, pouring broadside after broadside into the lumbering Spanish galleons. Their cannons tore through hulls, splintered masts, and set decks ablaze. The Spaniards fought bravely, but the tide had turned. Lacking anchors, driven by the wind, they could not reform their line. English firepower proved devastating, sinking several ships and crippling many more. For the first time, the myth of invincibility cracked. The Armada retreated northward, their plan to link with Parma in ruins. Yet their ordeal was only beginning. The wrath of the sea. Philip's fleet, battered and bloodied, turned toward home. But the Channel was not their only trial. As the Armada circled the British Isles, storms swept down with merciless force. Off the coasts of Scotland and Ireland, galleons were driven onto rocks, dashed to pieces in tempests. Survivors staggered ashore, only to meet death at the hands of locals fearful of invasion. By the time remnants of the Armada limped back to Spain, more than a third of the fleet was lost. Of the proud 130 ships that had sailed, barely half returned. Thousands of sailors and soldiers lay at the bottom of the sea or rotted on foreign shores. The Invincible fleet had been broken, not only by English cannon, but by the fury of the winds. The aftermath. The Armada's defeat resounded like a trumpet across Europe. For Spain, it was a humiliation cloaked in piety. Philip consoled himself that he had fought against God's will. For England, it was nothing less than deliverance, proof that Providence smiled upon the Protestant cause. The Armada portrait, painted soon after, captured Elizabeth with her hand upon a globe, the shattered fleet painted in the background, the Queen as symbol of triumph and destiny. Yet the victory was not total. The war with Spain continued for years, draining resources and testing endurance. But the Armada marked a turning point. Never again would Spain threaten England with such overwhelming force. Elizabeth had stood against the mightiest empire of the age and survived. The birth of a legend, the Battle of 1588, became more than history. It became myth. England remembered it not merely as a naval victory, but as a miracle. Ballads sang of Drake and Howard, of fire ships and storms. Preachers declared that God himself had raised his hand to scatter the enemy. And in Elizabeth, the people saw not only a queen, but a chosen guardian of the nation's destiny. From the smoke of battle and the wreckage of galleons, a new identity emerged. England was no longer a vulnerable island, but a rising maritime power. The survival of 1588 lit the path toward empire, seeding the belief that this small kingdom could stand against the giants of the world. The Armada was not merely a clash of fleets, it was the crucible in which the fate of England was forged. Against overwhelming odds, through daring, ingenuity, and the unpredictable hand of the sea, Elizabeth's realm endured. The storm of 1588 was both literal and symbolic, the tempest that destroyed an empire's ambitions and gave birth to another's destiny. Yet even as the cannons fell silent, the true weight of 1588 was only beginning to be felt. Its echoes would reshape not just the sea, but the soul of nations. The consequences of the Armada. The smoke had barely cleared from the waters of the Channel when the magnitude of the victory began to reveal itself. England, small and vulnerable, had stared into the face of annihilation and endured. The defeat of the Armada was not only a military triumph, but a psychological earthquake, reshaping the destiny of nations. A nation transformed. For the English people, the Armada's defeat felt like deliverance. Villages that had prepared for slaughter now erupted in celebration. Churches rang with thanksgiving, and preachers declared that the winds themselves had been instruments of providence. Elizabeth's reign, once shadowed by conspiracy and doubt, now gleamed with the aura of divine favor. She was no longer merely the Virgin Queen. She was the chosen protector of her people, Gloriana, whose hand had steered the nation through storm and fire. This surge of confidence was more than emotion. It was identity. England began to see itself as a nation apart, defended by God and the sea, destined for greatness. The humiliation of Calais, the terror of plots, the divisions of religion, all seemed to fade in the glow of 1588. Spain's wounded Colossus. For Spain, the consequences were grim. Though Philip II remained the most powerful monarch in Europe, the myth of his invincibility was shattered. The Armada had been envisioned as a weapon of destiny, yet it had returned broken, its ships scattered, its sailors dead. Europe now saw that Spain could be challenged, that its empire was not eternal. Still, Philip did not surrender. The war with England dragged on, fought in the seas of the Atlantic, the fields of the Netherlands, and the ports of Iberia. But the balance had shifted. Spain fought to preserve its dominance. England fought with the confidence of survival. The rise of naval power. Perhaps the most lasting consequence was the transformation of England's navy. The Armada proved that nimble, gunnery-based ships could triumph over lumbering giants built for boarding actions. It validated a new style of warfare, one that emphasized maneuver, firepower, and the mastery of the open sea. The English seafarers who had harassed Spain in the Channel, Drake, Hawkins, Frobisher, became legends, symbols of a new maritime destiny. From their daring raids and victories grew the conviction that England's future lay on the ocean, not on the continent. The Armada did not create the empire to come, but it lit the path toward it. Elizabeth's apotheosis. For Elizabeth herself, the consequences were profound. Her image, carefully crafted over decades, now crystallized into legend. The Armada portrait immortalized her as triumphant sovereign, hand upon the globe, eyes fixed on destiny. At Tilbury, her words had made her a warrior queen in the eyes of her people. The victory gave her an aura no plot or rival could diminish. Yet the triumph carried burdens. The war with Spain drained treasure and blood for years after 1588. Ireland erupted in costly rebellions. England's economy strained under taxation and debt. But even amid hardship, the memory of the Armada remained untarnished. It was the proof that Elizabeth had delivered her people from destruction. The turning of the age. The consequences of 1588 stretched beyond England's shores. Across Europe, Protestant states took heart, seeing in England's survival the possibility of resisting Catholic hegemony. The Dutch revolt gained new momentum. France, torn by its own wars of religion, now looked to England as a counterweight to Spanish power. The balance of Europe had shifted. The Armada's defeat did not end the conflict, but it redefined it. Spain remained mighty, Elizabeth's kingdom remained fragile, yet the trajectory of history bent toward the island realm. Out of peril, out of storm and fire, England had claimed a place on the stage of world power. And as cannons fell silent, another kind of power began to speak. Not from ships or soldiers, but from poets, playwrights, and the stage itself. The flourishing of literature and drama. If the clash of the Armada had secured England's survival, the years that followed revealed another kind of triumph, a flowering of the mind and spirit. Out of the smoke of battle rose a cultural renaissance that transformed Elizabeth's reign into more than a political era. It became an age of art, imagination, and words that would echo across centuries. A stage for a nation, London in the late 16th century pulsed with new energy. Its streets were crowded with merchants, sailors, apprentices, and nobles. Its taverns buzzed with stories of voyages and wars. Its printing presses churned out pamphlets and ballads. In this vibrant city, the theater became the heartbeat of a people discovering their voice. Playhouses like the Theater, the Curtain, and later the Globe rose on the outskirts of the city, their wooden frames housing worlds within. For a penny, commoners could crowd into the pit, jostling shoulder to shoulder, while wealthier patrons looked on from the galleries. Here England told stories to itself, of kings and clowns, lovers and traitors, saints and sinners. The stage became a mirror of the realm, reflecting both its anxieties and its dreams. Shakespeare and his contemporaries. At the center of this flowering stood William Shakespeare, the son of a Stratford glovemaker who became the voice of an age. His plays, performed before roaring crowds and royal courtiers alike, wove together history, comedy, tragedy, and poetry with unparalleled skill. Richard III and Henry V dramatized England's past, shaping national memory with soaring lines of patriotism. Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet probed the depths of love and despair. A Midsummer Night's Dream spun gossamer visions of enchantment. But Shakespeare was not alone. Christopher Marlowe, fiery and daring, gave the world Dr. Faustus and Tamburlaine, works that pushed boundaries of ambition and desire. Edmund Spenser, with his epic Fairy Queen, clothed Elizabeth herself in allegory as Gloriana, a monarch of virtue and myth. Ben Jonson, Thomas Kyd, and a host of others filled the stages with words that shimmered with power. Together, they forged a golden age of drama unmatched in Europe. Patronage and politics. This flourishing was no accident of chance. It was nurtured by patronage and politics. Elizabeth's court, though cautious about censorship, recognized the value of art as a tool of unity and image. Pageants and masks celebrated her rule. Poets cast her as goddess and protector, and playwrights turned her victories into allegories of divine favor. The arts were also a subtle weapon in the battle of ideas. In an age when sermons and books carried weight, plays carried more. They reached thousands, crossing class lines and uniting rich and poor in shared experience. The theater became both entertainment and education, instilling a sense of English identity that transcended the fractures of religion and politics. A nation finds its voice. By the 1590s, England's literature and drama had become its proudest export. Ambassadors marveled at the creativity of a nation once dismissed as culturally backward. The words of Shakespeare and Spenser, the music of Dowland, the architecture of Inigo Jones, all proclaimed that England was not merely surviving, but thriving. This was more than art. It was nationhood. The flowering of literature gave England a voice on the world stage, a voice confident, witty, profound, and enduring. In the words spoken on the boards of the globe, a people forged their sense of self, their sense of destiny. The defeat of the Armada had secured Elizabeth's kingdom against conquest, but it was the flowering of culture that crowned her reign with glory. The stage, the poem, the song, these became as much weapons of identity as any cannon or sword. The Elizabethan Golden Age was not only fought on the seas, it was dreamed into being in the words of its poets and dramatists. Out of turbulence, England had found its voice, and with it, immortality. And while words and music gave England its soul, curiosity gave it wings. Carrying the spirit of the age beyond theaters and poems, out across oceans, and into the heavens. Science, exploration, and the expansion of knowledge. The Golden Age was not confined to the stage or the page. It reached outward, across seas, into the heavens, and into the very foundations of human understanding. Elizabeth's reign unfolded at a moment when curiosity itself became a force of power, when men began to see the world not as a closed book of tradition, but as a boundless horizon waiting to be explored. The Age of Discovery. England, once a peripheral kingdom, now turned its gaze across the oceans. Spanish and Portuguese ships had long dominated the Atlantic, pouring wealth from the Americas and the Indies into Iberian coffers. Yet English sailors, restless and daring, were unwilling to remain bystanders. Figures like Sir Francis Drake, Sir John Hawkins, and Sir Walter Raleigh carried the flag of St. George into uncharted waters. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580 was nothing short of audacious. Setting sail with a handful of ships, he returned 3 years later with one vessel, the Golden Hind, its hold heavy with treasure, and its crew hardened by peril. England erupted in celebration. Drake was knighted by Elizabeth herself, his voyage proclaimed as proof that a small island nation could challenge empires across the seas. Raleigh, meanwhile, looked westward to the New World. His expeditions sought to establish colonies in Virginia, named in honor of the Virgin Queen. Though these early attempts faltered, the lost colony of Roanoke still shrouded in mystery, they planted seeds of ambition that would one day grow into empire. Knowledge expands. The voyages of discovery were not merely about gold or glory. They were about knowledge. Maps were redrawn, coastlines charted, oceans measured. English cartographers, inspired by the reports of sailors, began to depict the world with increasing accuracy. The once mysterious Atlantic became a theater of opportunity rather than a barrier of fear. At the same time, a revolution in thought was stirring. Men like Francis Bacon challenged the dominance of scholastic tradition, arguing for observation, experiment, and reason. His writings laid the foundation for modern science, urging that truth must be discovered through the patient study of nature rather than accepted by rote authority. Astronomy, too, captured imaginations. The heavens, once seen as immutable, now became a field of inquiry. Though Copernicus and Galileo belonged to the continent, their ideas reverberated through England, stirring debates in universities and at court. The Elizabethan age was one of opening doors, of minds, as well as of oceans. The spirit of curiosity. This thirst for discovery was not confined to scholars or sailors. It seeped into the culture itself. Pamphlets described distant lands filled with marvels. Plays staged exotic settings. Ballads told of voyages to golden cities and enchanted islands. For the English imagination, the world was expanding daily, filled with wonder, danger, and promise. Elizabeth herself encouraged this spirit, if cautiously. She balanced ambition with prudence, wary of provoking Spain yet unwilling to stifle England's hunger for exploration. Her court became a place where sailors recounted their adventures, where maps adorned council walls, where the idea of empire began to take root in the collective consciousness. Thus, the Elizabethan Golden Age was not only a season of art, but of discovery. It was an era when English ships circled the globe, when new lands were glimpsed, when old certainties gave way to new questions. The defeat of the Armada had secured the nation's survival. Exploration and science promised it a future. In the restless voyages of Drake and Raleigh, in the probing mind of Bacon, in the new maps and the new stars, England began to see itself not as an island on Europe's edge, but as a world power in the making. The horizon was no longer an end, it was a beginning. And at the very center of this age of discovery and imagination stood Elizabeth herself, not only as queen, but as the living symbol through which her people envisioned their destiny. Elizabeth as cultural icon, Gloriana and Astrea. The Elizabethan Golden Age was not only marked by fleets on the seas or words upon the stage, it was embodied in the Queen herself. Elizabeth became more than a monarch. She was transformed into a cultural icon, a living myth, woven into the fabric of poetry, pageantry, and imagination. To her subjects, she was not merely a woman ruling in a world of men. She was Gloriana, Astrea, the Virgin Queen, a figure who seemed to stand above the ordinary boundaries of history. Gloriana, the radiant sovereign. In Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queen, Elizabeth appeared under the allegorical guise of Gloriana, the queen of a mystical realm, radiant and virtuous. The poem, dedicated to her glory, was both literature and propaganda, blending myth with politics. Through Spenser's verses, Elizabeth became the embodiment of justice, wisdom, and triumph over chaos. She was not simply ruler of England. She was the heroine of an epic written into the collective memory of her people. This image of Gloriana resonated far beyond the page. In masks and pageants, Elizabeth was greeted as a semi-divine figure. Cities she visited transformed their streets into theaters of myth. Triumphal arches, allegorical speeches, and costumed actors celebrated her as the sun dispersing darkness, the mother of her people, the light of a new age. Astrea, the Virgin of Justice. Alongside Gloriana, another figure was woven into her image. Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice, who, according to classical myth, had abandoned the corrupt earth in ancient times, but was prophesied to return in a new golden age. Elizabeth was cast as that returning goddess, the bringer of harmony after decades of turmoil. Artists and poets invoked Astrea to present the queen as untouched by corruption, a ruler whose chastity was symbolic rather than private. By remaining unmarried, Elizabeth seemed to embody a divine purity, devoted not to a husband, but to her people. In this symbolism, her celibacy was no longer a weakness, but a strength, a mark of transcendence. The politics of image. This cultural iconography was not an accident of flattery. It was a deliberate political strategy. Elizabeth and her advisors recognized the power of myth to bind a divided realm. Where her father had ruled by force and her sister by fear, Elizabeth ruled by image. Portraits depicted her with ageless beauty, elaborate gowns glittering with jewels and symbols of empire, her hand resting upon a globe, her eyes commanding the horizon. Such imagery served as a kind of theater of monarchy. To see Elizabeth was to see England itself, wrapped in majesty, immortalized in art. Her portraits were less likeness than symbol, projecting stability, power, and divine favor in a world of uncertainty. A living myth. By the 1590s, Elizabeth's image had become inseparable from the identity of her realm. To the common people, she was a figure of awe. To poets and dramatists, she was muse and symbol. To foreign ambassadors, she was an enigma, elusive yet commanding. Her very presence in public became a performance, each word, gesture, and procession crafted to reinforce the mythology. Yet beneath the layers of Gloriana and Astrea remained a mortal woman, cautious, calculating, sometimes fearful. The power of her image lay in its ability to conceal vulnerability, to transform frailty into majesty. In Elizabeth's reign, politics and culture fused into legend. Elizabeth's transformation into Gloriana and Astrea ensured her reign would outlive her mortal years. She became not just the ruler of an island kingdom, but the symbol of a new age, an age of order, poetry, discovery, and destiny. The Virgin Queen's body might have been flesh and blood, but her image was immortal, crafted in words, art, and myth. Thus, the Golden Age was crowned not only by victory at sea or triumph in theaters, but by the enduring vision of Elizabeth herself, a queen who became a legend, a mortal who became timeless. And while her image ruled hearts and minds, it was on the oceans that Elizabeth's England began to test its strength, where legend met salt and steel. Privateers and the call of the seas. If Elizabeth's image as Gloriana embodied the soul of the Golden Age, it was the salt of the sea that gave it muscle. In the decades after the Armada, England's ambitions spilled beyond its shores, carried on the backs of ships and men who blurred the lines between merchants, pirates, and patriots. They were called privateers, licensed by the crown, feared by Spain, and celebrated by their countrymen. Their daring raids and distant voyages were more than acts of plunder. They were the first pulses of an empire, being born. The Queen's Sea Dogs. Elizabeth's court produced a generation of seafarers whose names became legend. Sir Francis Drake, Sir John Hawkins, Martin Frobisher, and Walter Raleigh. They were men of restless ambition, drawn by the lure of treasure and the thrill of the unknown. But their sails carried not only personal dreams. They bore the hopes of a kingdom eager to challenge Spain's dominance on the seas. Spain's empire stretched from the silver mines of Potosi to the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, and its wealth flowed homeward in great treasure fleets. To the English, these convoys were not sacred symbols of God's order, as Philip claimed, but floating vaults ripe for the taking. Privateering became state policy by another name. Elizabeth issued letters of marque, legalizing plunder against Spanish ships, and in return took a share of the spoils. The results were spectacular. Drake's capture of the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, nicknamed the Cacafuego, netted riches so immense they dazzled Europe. When he returned from circumnavigating the globe, his hold bursting with Spanish treasure, Elizabeth herself went aboard the Golden Hind to knight him. It was more than ceremony. It was a message to Philip. England would no longer kneel before the Spanish monopoly of the seas. War by another name. Privateering was both war and commerce. Officially, Elizabeth maintained the posture of diplomacy, denying responsibility for raids. In practice, she encouraged them, using privateers as a cheap, flexible navy that struck where Spain was weakest. These raids destabilized Spain's empire. Harbors in the Caribbean were torched, galleons captured, settlements raided. Spanish officials raged at what they called piracy. English ballads praised their heroes as defenders of Protestant liberty. Each captured ship was a blow not only to Spain's wealth, but to its prestige. Yet privateering also carried risks. Crews sometimes turned on each other, expeditions collapsed in storms, and losses were heavy. For every triumph like Drake's, there were failures that cost lives and treasure. But the English appetite for risk, sharpened by Elizabeth's cautious encouragement, made the seas an arena where the kingdom could challenge powers far richer and larger than itself. The lure of the New World. Beyond raiding, privateers paved the way for colonization. Walter Raleigh's ventures in Virginia were direct offspring of this seafaring spirit. Though his colonies failed, their very attempt revealed England's growing ambition to stake a claim in the New World, to transform piracy into empire. Privateering opened doors to trade as well. Hawkins and others trafficked not only in goods but in the grim commerce of enslaved Africans, beginning England's tragic entanglement in the transatlantic slave trade. For contemporaries, it was seen as commerce and power. For history, it remains a stain upon the age. Yet even in its darkest enterprises, the privateering impulse expanded England's reach, connecting it to global networks of wealth and exploitation. A nation awakens to the sea. By the close of the 16th century, England's identity was no longer that of an island clinging to survival. It was a seafaring nation, its confidence shaped by privateers who proved that Spanish galleons could be humbled and Spanish ports burned. Elizabeth's sea dogs were both the sword and the symbol of this transformation. They showed that the sea was not a barrier but a highway, not a prison but a promise. With every raid and every voyage, they nudged England further down the path toward maritime power. Privateering was the crucible in which England tested its strength against Spain and discovered its destiny upon the waters. It was messy, perilous, and often brutal, yet it forged a new national identity. The Virgin Queen's sailors did not merely plunder. They announced to the world that England would no longer be a passive bystander. From the smoke of raids and the glitter of captured treasure, a vision began to form. England as a naval power, heir to the seas, destined to reach far beyond its shores. The call of the ocean had been answered, and England would never again look inward. Yet even as fire and plunder carved England's name upon the seas, another force was quietly taking shape. One built not on raids, but on trade. The East India Company and the rise of global trade. If privateers announced England's defiance upon the seas, it was trade that promised endurance. Plunder could dazzle, but commerce could sustain. Out of Elizabeth's reign emerged not only tales of daring captains, but the foundations of a system that would one day carry English influence to every corner of the globe. That foundation was the East India Company, born in 1600, from plunder to profit. By the 1590s, the lure of distant markets had become irresistible. The Portuguese and Spanish had grown rich on spices, silks, and precious goods carried from Asia. Nutmeg, cloves, pepper, and cinnamon, luxuries once rarer than gold, transformed European kitchens, apothecaries, and treasuries. The Dutch were rising as formidable rivals, their fleets muscling into Asian waters. For England to remain only a nation of raiders was to remain on the margins. Merchants in London, restless with ambition, petitioned Elizabeth for a charter to trade directly with the East. On the last day of the 16th century, December 31st, 1600, she granted it. The East India Company was born, a joint stock venture of merchants whose fortunes and risks would be pooled together. It was a radical idea, blending commerce with collective investment, designed to spread both profit and peril. The vision of empire in commerce. The company's first voyages set sail for the East Indies. Their holds filled with English cloth and silver, their eyes fixed on the spices of the archipelagos. The risks were enormous: storms, scurvy, hostile fleets, uncertain markets. Yet the rewards were dazzling. When the ships returned with cargoes of pepper and cloves, the profits ignited London's imagination. Elizabeth's signature upon the charter had done more than authorize trade. It had planted a seed of empire. These were not mere voyages of adventure, but the first tendrils of a commercial network that would bind England to Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Where Drake and Hawkins had struck blows against Spain, the company promised enduring wealth, negotiated not with cannon fire, but with contracts and warehouses. A new kind of power. The East India Company represented a shift in how power itself was conceived. No longer would expansion be left only to monarchs and their treasuries. Now, merchants and investors could wield influence, their capital and ships becoming instruments of national power. Elizabeth's England, once cash-strapped and cautious, had stumbled upon a formula for sustainable expansion. Though its first decades were tentative, the company's creation marked a turning point. It transformed England from a challenger to Spanish wealth into an aspirant for global markets. In its ledgers and ships lay the outlines of a world order that would one day be called empire. The Queen's final gift. Elizabeth would not live to see the full flowering of this institution. Yet her decision to charter the company was among the most consequential acts of her reign. It reflected her genius for balance, encouraging ambition while limiting risk, granting authority while keeping ultimate control in the crown's hands. In the waning years of her life, as the court whispered of succession and her health waned, the East India Company stood as a promise of continuity. Whatever storms might come, England had set its hand to the wheel of global trade. Thus, from the smoke of privateering, emerged the order of commerce. The East India Company was no fleet of raiders, but a machine of profit, a new weapon in England's arsenal. Where Drake's cannons had rattled Spain's empire, the company's spices and silks would open doors to Asia and beyond. It was Elizabeth's final decade, and her nation was already straining toward horizons she would never see. Yet the charter she signed in 1600 ensured that England's destiny was no longer bound to the island or the Channel. Its future was global, its reach inexorable, and its story only beginning. And as the crown looked outward to empire, within England itself a quieter revolution was underway, led not by sailors or soldiers, but by merchants and their wealth. Merchants, wealth, and the rise of a new class. While Elizabeth's navy and explorers captured the imagination, It was merchants who quietly reshaped the foundations of English society. In the late 16th century, wealth was no longer measured only in acres of land or titles of nobility. It began to flow through counting houses, docks, and the ledgers of men who risked fortunes on trade. Out of the Golden Age emerged a new class, wealthy merchants and investors whose influence would ripple far beyond Elizabeth's lifetime. The new engines of wealth. The cloth trade had long been England's economic backbone, with raw wool shipped abroad for weaving. But under Elizabeth, merchants pushed further. They sought new markets, striking deals in the Baltic, the Mediterranean, and across the Atlantic. With every voyage, English ships returned not only with goods, but with stories of distant ports, of sugar from the Caribbean, spices from the Indies, and treasures from Africa. The profits could be staggering. A single successful voyage might enrich investors for a lifetime. Men who had once been common traders now built mansions in London, rivaling the grandeur of noble estates. Their wealth flowed into civic life, funding schools, hospitals, and guilds, but also buying influence in Parliament. The balance of power in England began to shift, not away from the crown, but into a broader base of moneyed men. London, a city transformed. Nowhere was this change more visible than in London. The city became a bustling hub of global commerce, its docks crowded with ships, its warehouses stacked with exotic goods. Merchants gathered in coffee houses and counting rooms where news of voyages could alter fortunes overnight. The Royal Exchange, founded earlier by Sir Thomas Gresham, became the beating heart of this new economy. Beneath its vaulted arcades, deals were struck that bound London not only to Antwerp or Venice, but to Goa, Mexico, and the Caribbean. Elizabeth herself visited the exchange, acknowledging the rising importance of commerce in her kingdom. The city's expansion mirrored its ambition. Streets widened, new districts emerged, and wealth poured into the construction of theaters, guild halls, and houses of worship. London was no longer just a capital. It was a marketplace of the world, the clash of old and new. Yet the rise of the merchant class also unsettled traditional hierarchies. England's nobility, rooted in land and lineage, viewed these new men with suspicion. To them, wealth earned through trade seemed vulgar, unstable, even dangerous. But money speaks louder than disdain. As merchants purchased estates, intermarried with lesser nobles, and secured political offices, the lines between old aristocracy and new wealth began to blur. Elizabeth, ever pragmatic, encouraged this balance. She relied on the nobility for loyalty and the merchants for revenue. By fostering both, she bound together the old world of chivalry and the new world of commerce. It was a delicate equilibrium, but one that gave her reign both stability and dynamism. A foreshadowing of change. The rise of this new class foreshadowed a future where wealth and commerce would become the engines of English power. Merchants, enriched by overseas trade, would one day bankroll colonies, finance wars, and influence policy on a scale once reserved for monarchs and nobles. Their story was only beginning, but under Elizabeth, the first outlines were drawn. Thus, the Elizabethan Golden Age was not only a theater of poetry and conquest, but a crucible of economic transformation. The merchant class, forged in the risks of trade and the profits of discovery, began to alter England's very structure. They built the wealth that funded theaters and voyages. They reshaped London into a global hub, and they shifted power toward a broader, more restless base. Elizabeth may have been the Virgin Queen, radiant on her throne, but beneath her reign, a new force was stirring, a class of merchants whose ledgers would one day rival the swords of knights. Out of their ambition rose not only wealth, but the foundations of empire. Yet even as trade and wealth promised a new future, the present bore heavier chains. For behind the glitter of Elizabeth's golden age lay the grinding weight of endless war and debt. War, debt, and the burden of empire. The glow of the Armada's defeat and the brilliance of England's cultural flowering masked a harsher truth. Elizabeth's later years were burdened by war, mounting debt, and the heavy costs of ambition. The Golden Age was gilded, but its splendor was sustained by sacrifices that strained crown and country alike. Endless war with Spain. Though the Armada had been scattered in 1588, Spain did not retreat from conflict. Philip II launched further expeditions, rebuilt fleets, and continued the struggle for dominance. The war stretched into a grinding stalemate across Europe and the Atlantic. English privateers still raided, but their victories no longer came with the dazzling windfalls of earlier years. Spain adapted, strengthening its convoys and fortifying its ports. Campaigns in the Low Countries drained English coffers, while naval expeditions often consumed more resources than they returned. The Earl of Essex's costly campaign in Ireland, meant to suppress rebellion and block Spanish influence, ended in disaster, leaving England poorer and more embittered. Victory at sea had saved England from invasion, but prolonged war threatened to exhaust it from within. The weight of debt. The Crown's finances, already fragile, groaned under the burden. Elizabeth inherited a monarchy with limited revenue, reliant on taxation, customs duties, and forced loans. War multiplied expenses beyond precedent. Ships to be built, soldiers to be paid, supplies to be bought. The Queen, famously frugal in her personal habits, stretched every shilling, recycling her gowns, bargaining with suppliers, and delaying payments. Yet even her thrift could not overcome the mathematics of war. By the 1590s, England's debt swelled alarmingly. Officials scrambled for new sources of income, squeezing merchants, gentry, and commoners alike. Resentment grew. The taxes that funded fleets also emptied pockets in London and villages alike. The glitter of Elizabeth's court seemed distant to those who bore the weight of her policies. The strain of empire's shadow. What England possessed in ambition, it lacked in infrastructure. Spain's empire was vast, supported by the silver of the Americas. England's ventures were precarious, reliant on risk and hope. Colonies like Raleigh's Virginia faltered, expeditions failed, and Irish rebellions revealed how tenuous Elizabeth's grip on the fringes of her realm could be. Ireland was the deepest wound. There, resistance to English rule was fierce and unrelenting. The 9 Years' War, led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, dragged on from 1594 into the final years of Elizabeth's reign. Brutal campaigns scorched the land, villages were destroyed, and famine followed. Spanish aid to the Irish rebels escalated the conflict into a proxy war. Elizabeth poured treasure and troops into Ireland, but victory came only at staggering cost, leaving bitterness that would fester for generations. A kingdom under strain. By the end of the century, the burdens of war and debt weighed visibly upon the Queen herself. The radiant Gloriana of earlier decades aged into a weary monarch, her once celebrated beauty veiled in paint and jewels, her vigor fading. Behind the glitter of pageantry, her court was riddled with faction, her ministers aged, and her people restless under taxation. Yet even in decline, Elizabeth's reign retained a strange resilience. The myth of the Virgin Queen still held the nation together, even as cracks widened beneath. She had preserved England's independence, secured its Protestant identity, and opened the door to global ambition. But she had done so at great cost, one her successors would inherit in both opportunity and burden. The later years of Elizabeth's reign revealed the paradox of empire's birth. Triumph brought responsibility, and victory carried debt. England had survived Spain, blossomed in culture, and ventured across oceans. But these achievements strained the kingdom to its limits. Elizabeth, the cautious queen who once avoided risk, had presided over an era of unrelenting conflict and ambition. As she entered her final years, the glow of the Golden Age was dimmed by shadows of war, exhaustion, and debt, a reminder that even glory demands a price. And as if war and debt were not burden enough, an even darker uncertainty loomed. the unanswered question of who would wear the crown after Elizabeth. The crisis of succession. As war drained England's coffers and age crept upon Elizabeth, another shadow lengthened across her reign. The question of succession. For decades it had haunted her court like a silent ghost, whispered in corridors, debated in Parliament, speculated upon in every foreign embassy. Elizabeth had never married, never produced an heir, and never clearly named who should follow her. In a monarchy where continuity meant stability, this silence was deafening. The Virgin Queen's gamble. From her earliest years, Elizabeth understood that marriage was a trap as much as an opportunity. To wed a foreign prince risked turning England into a pawn of foreign powers. To choose an English noble invited factional rivalry and jealousy. By remaining single, she turned her body into a symbol. The Virgin Queen, wedded to her people, bound only to England itself. The gamble paid dividends in myth and loyalty, but it left the future perilous. Every illness Elizabeth suffered sent ripples of fear through the court. If she died without an heir, who would inherit? Would it be James VI of Scotland, descended from Henry VII's line through Margaret Tudor, or some Catholic claimant backed by Spain and Rome? The uncertainty was a weapon her enemies wielded constantly, and it kept England poised on the brink of crisis. Court intrigue and anxiety. At home, courtiers maneuvered with subtlety and calculation, aligning themselves with potential successors while feigning loyalty to Elizabeth's silence. Parliament, too, pressed the Queen to settle the matter, urging her to name an heir or take a husband. Each time Elizabeth parried with wit and evasion. To name a successor, she argued, was to invite rebellion in her own lifetime. Better to keep the question shrouded and so protect her throne. Her strategy worked, but at a price. The absence of certainty fostered unease. In taverns and pamphlets, rumors swirled of conspiracies to seize the throne upon her death. Foreign ambassadors schemed, reporting back to Madrid, Rome, and Paris with lists of claimants and predictions of civil war. The succession crisis was not merely an English concern. It was a European obsession. The Scottish question. Among all candidates, James VI of Scotland loomed largest. Protestant, pragmatic, and descended from Henry VII through Margaret Tudor, his claim was strong. Yet Elizabeth never declared him heir. To do so would have diminished her own authority, turning her reign into a prelude rather than a destiny. Still, through secret correspondence and cautious diplomacy, English ministers kept James in reserve, preparing him quietly for the day when Elizabeth's silence would end with her death. Mary Stuart's execution had cleared the field of Catholic rivals within England. But abroad, Spain still dreamed of placing an archduchess or Catholic prince upon the throne. The succession question was more than dynastic. It was bound to the survival of Protestant England itself. A queen in decline. By the final years of her reign, Elizabeth's refusal to name an heir grew increasingly tragic. The once vivid queen, radiant with wit and charisma, now wore heavy wigs and thick paint to mask her age. Her courtiers whispered of melancholy, of long nights spent in silence, of the weight of solitude pressing upon her. The crown still gleamed, but the woman beneath it was fading. And still she would not speak the words that might settle her realm's future. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps fear, perhaps an instinctive understanding that the aura of Gloriana depended upon being eternal, not transitional. To name a successor was to admit that she, too, must pass. The crisis of succession defined Elizabeth's later years as much as debt and war. Her silence was both shield and sword, protecting her reign but imperiling the future. When she finally breathed her last in 1603, the throne passed peacefully to James VI of Scotland, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. But this resolution came not from Elizabeth's design, but from necessity and her ministers' quiet preparation. The Virgin Queen left behind no heir, no dynasty, only a legacy. Her refusal to bind the future made her reign uniquely her own, brilliant, uncertain, and unforgettable. And so, as the question of succession lingered unanswered, Elizabeth herself began to fade, the legend still radiant, but the woman beneath it entering her final twilight. The waning of the Queen. The last act of Elizabeth's reign unfolded not in triumphal parades or thunderous victories, but in shadows. After 4 decades on the throne, the Virgin Queen, once radiant with youth and brilliance, entered a twilight marked by loss, fatigue, and the inexorable weight of time. The woman who had outmaneuvered kings, faced armadas, and mastered the theater of power now confronted an enemy no wit or stratagem could defy: her own mortality. A court of ghosts. By the late 1590s, the faces around Elizabeth had changed. Many of her trusted counselors were gone. William Cecil, her steadfast secretary, had died in 1598, leaving a void filled uneasily by his son Robert. Francis Walsingham, the spy master who had safeguarded her throne, was long dead. Even her sea dogs, Drake and Hawkins, had succumbed to illness on distant voyages. One by one, the architects of her golden age vanished, leaving Elizabeth increasingly alone. The Queen, who had once commanded loyalty through charisma, now presided over a court riddled with intrigue. Ambitious nobles vied for influence, their rivalries spilling into open conflict. The most dramatic was the fall of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. Once Elizabeth's favorite, his reckless rebellion in 1601 ended in execution. His death broke her spirit. To many, it seemed that the Virgin Queen had outlived not only her friends, but her very age. The weight of years' time left its marks upon the body that had once been a symbol of England's vitality. Elizabeth's famous red-gold hair turned thin and gray, hidden beneath heavy wigs. Her face, once celebrated for its beauty, was masked with layers of white paint, giving her an almost spectral appearance. Court observers whispered of a monarch who lingered in memory rather than reality, her grandeur now a fragile performance. Yet even in decline, she clung fiercely to her majesty. She refused to retire from the public gaze, appearing in elaborate gowns adorned with jewels, projecting an image of eternal sovereignty. But behind the glitter, courtiers saw the toll of age. Melancholy weighed upon her. She ate little, slept poorly, and spent long hours in silence. It was said she sat motionless for hours, staring into the shadows, haunted by the ghosts of her past. The end approaches. The Queen's decline mirrored the exhaustion of her realm. War with Spain lingered, Ireland drained resources, and succession remained uncertain. Though victories had been won, the costs pressed heavily upon the people. Yet Elizabeth's presence still held the kingdom together. Her silence about an heir, though perilous, reinforced her image as eternal, as if England could not imagine itself without her. In March 1603, Elizabeth fell gravely ill. She refused to take to her bed, preferring instead to rest upon cushions on the floor, as though surrendering to illness was beneath her dignity. Her courtiers, desperate for guidance, begged her to name a successor. At last, with gestures more than words, she indicated James VI of Scotland, the cousin she had never openly declared but whom her ministers had long prepared to receive the crown. On March 24th, Elizabeth I died at Richmond Palace. She was 70 years old. With her, the Tudor dynasty ended, closing a century of fire and transformation. The waning of Elizabeth was not marked by collapse, but by a slow fading of light. She had ruled longer than any Tudor, carried her kingdom through storms of religion and war, and carved her image into the very soul of her people. Yet her final years were a reminder that even legends grow weary. Even Gloriana must bow to time. Her death was not the end of England's story, but it was the end of an age. The Elizabethan Golden Age, with its triumphs, tragedies, and myths, closed in silence, leaving behind a nation transformed, and a queen remembered as both mortal and immortal. And though the crown passed to another, the spirit of Elizabeth lingered. For what she left behind was greater than a dynasty, it was a legend. The legacy of Elizabeth and the Golden Age. Elizabeth died in 1603, but her shadow stretched far beyond her mortal years. The Virgin Queen left no heir, no dynastic continuity, only the memory of her reign. Yet that memory proved more powerful than bloodlines, for it became myth. What England inherited from her was not merely a crown, but a story. The story of survival, splendor, and transformation. The Elizabethan Golden Age was born as much in legend as in fact, but its power has endured for centuries. A nation forged in fire. Elizabeth's reign was marked by turmoil, religious divisions, conspiracies, foreign threats, and the constant specter of war. Yet out of this crucible emerged a stronger, more confident nation. She inherited a kingdom fractured by her father's break with Rome and her sister's persecutions. She left behind a Protestant state with a distinct identity. The Elizabethan settlement, though imperfect, endured as the foundation of the Church of England, a compromise that stabilized the realm and defined English religious life for generations. This ability to turn conflict into resilience became the essence of her legacy. To contemporaries, the defeat of the Armada symbolized divine deliverance. To historians, it was a testament to strategic vision and the adaptation of new naval tactics. In both memory and fact, Elizabeth presided over the moment when England ceased to be a vulnerable island and began to dream of itself as a world power. The Queen as myth. Elizabeth's greatest creation may have been herself. Through portraits, pageantry, and poetry, she crafted an image that outlived her body. She was Gloriana, the radiant queen of Spenser's epic. Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice returned to earth. The Virgin Queen, wedded not to man, but to her people. These images were political tools, but they became national mythology. Even as she aged, even as her court whispered of her decline, the image endured. To her people, Elizabeth was eternal, not a woman of flesh, but a symbol of stability and destiny. This blending of politics and performance gave England something unique, a monarch who was also an icon, a living emblem of national identity. The cultural legacy. No account of Elizabeth's legacy can ignore the cultural flowering of her reign. Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spenser, and Johnson gave English literature a voice that would echo across the world. The theater, once viewed with suspicion, became the stage of the nation's soul. The English language itself was enriched, stretched, and immortalized in words spoken on Elizabethan stages. This cultural renaissance was not isolated from politics. It was part of the Queen's reign. Plays of kingship and rebellion reflected anxieties about her rule. Allegories of justice and virtue mirrored her image. When Elizabeth attended performances, the stage became a dialogue between sovereign and people, art and power intertwined. The Golden Age was thus not only fought on battlefields, but imagined in theaters, printed in books, and sung in ballads. The birth of a naval power. Elizabeth's reign also marked the turning of England toward the sea. Privateers like Drake and Hawkins, explorers like Raleigh, and merchants who launched the East India Company all set the foundations of England's future as a maritime power. Though much of this expansion was precarious, often marked by failure or brutality, it created a new horizon. The idea of England as mistress of the seas, protected by God and by her navy, took root in these years. Later generations would look back on 1588 as the birth of that maritime destiny. In truth, it was less a birth than a promise, a glimpse of what would come. But the promise was enough. It made the Golden Age not only an age of survival, but of aspiration. The cost of glory. Yet Elizabeth's legacy was not without shadows. Her later years were marked by war, debt, and repression. Ireland bled under her campaigns, leaving scars that would shape Anglo-Irish relations for centuries. The rise of privateering brought not only treasure, but England's first steps into the transatlantic slave trade, a legacy as dark as it is lasting. Domestically, the burdens of taxation and economic strain weighed heavily on her people. The Golden Age glittered at court and in theaters, but in villages and towns, hardship remained. The myth often concealed the reality, that Elizabeth's triumphs were purchased at great cost. The end of the Tudors, the beginning of something greater. With Elizabeth's death, the Tudor dynasty ended. The crown passed to James VI of Scotland, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland in a new Stuart monarchy. Many feared chaos at her passing, but the transition was surprisingly smooth. In part, this was due to careful preparation by her ministers. In part, it was due to the sheer power of her legend. England was reluctant to let go of Gloriana, but it was ready to continue her legacy under new rulers. In retrospect, Elizabeth's reign became the pivot between medieval and modern England. She presided over the last great age of personal monarchy, where image and charisma held a nation together. And yet she set in motion the forces, commerce, exploration, cultural identity, that would propel England into the modern world. The Golden Age. Remembered. The phrase Elizabethan Golden Age itself speaks to memory as much as to reality. Her reign was neither free of hardship nor universally golden, but it was remembered as such because she turned survival into triumph, division into unity, and vulnerability into ambition. Later generations, facing their own crises, would look back to Elizabeth's time as a model of resilience. Poets remembered her as Gloriana, historians as the builder of a Protestant state, sailors as the queen who knighted Drake on his ship, dramatists as the patron of a flowering age. To the common people, she remained the Virgin Queen, who had faced down Spain and preserved their land. Elizabeth I left behind no child to carry her name, but she left behind something far greater, a nation transformed and a myth immortal. She entered history as the daughter of a king who broke with Rome and a queen who tried to undo it. But she left as the monarch who gave England its voice, its confidence, and its vision of destiny. The Golden Age she presided over was not merely the result of her policies or victories. It was the product of her presence, her image, and her ability to turn politics into legend. When she died, England mourned not just a queen, but an age itself. And yet, the legend endured. To this day, Elizabeth I stands as one of history's most iconic rulers. The queen who faced armadas, ruled with charisma, inspired poets, and became the symbol of an England that began to see itself not as a fragile island, but as a world power. The woman had passed, but Gloriana remained, eternal in memory, timeless in myth. And so, when the morning bells tolled in 1603, what was buried was not only a queen, but the very embodiment of an age, though her legend refused to rest. Epilogue. Gloriana's Shadow. The story of Elizabeth I ends not with her death, but with her legend. In the spring of 1603, the Virgin Queen was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, her coffin resting above that of her half-sister, Mary VIII, a symbolic union of two rival queens who had divided England in life but lay together in death. The Tudor dynasty was extinguished, yet its flame burned brightest in its last sovereign. Elizabeth's reign had been a tapestry woven of contradictions. She was cautious yet daring, pragmatic yet theatrical, solitary yet adored. She refused to marry, yet became the mother of her nation. She presided over war and hardship, yet her age was remembered for poetry, music, and triumph. Her rule was not free of shadow, Ireland scarred, debt-heavy, succession uncertain, yet in the imagination of her people, she transformed hardship into destiny. The end of an age. With her death, England stepped into a new era under the Stuarts. James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting two crowns in a single head. The dynastic change brought fresh challenges, religious tension, political disputes, and the seeds of future civil war. Yet the memory of Elizabeth's reign lingered like sunlight after sunset. She had given her people a vision of unity, resilience, and greatness that would shape their expectations for generations. The myth that endures. Elizabeth became more than a figure of history. She became an archetype. To poets and playwrights, she was Astrea, Gloriana, the eternal queen. To her people, she was the Virgin Queen, who had faced down the might of Spain and secured their land. To later generations, she became the very embodiment of a golden age, an era when England found its voice in Shakespeare, its courage on the seas, and its confidence in the face of empires. The reality was more complex, but myths endure not because they are flawless, but because they are powerful. Elizabeth's myth was one of survival against odds, of transformation from vulnerability to strength, of a woman who stood alone and yet became the symbol of a nation. A legacy beyond blood. Unlike other monarchs, Elizabeth left no heir to carry her name, yet her legacy was not bound to lineage. It was bound to identity. The England she left behind was stronger, prouder, and more ambitious than the one she inherited. It was a kingdom that had tasted survival and dreamed of empire, a people who had discovered in their queen a reflection of themselves. In this lies her greatest legacy. She taught England to see itself as a nation of destiny, not merely a survivor of storms, but a force upon the world stage. Elizabeth I's life was a drama of triumph and trial, of masks and crowns, of words and wars. Her reign was the climax of the Tudor story, and the prologue to England's rise as a world power. She began as a precarious queen in a divided land. She ended as Gloriana, the immortal sovereign of legend. Centuries later, her shadow still lingers. In every play of Shakespeare, in every image of the Armada, in every phrase of the Golden Age, we glimpse not only a queen but the myth she became. Elizabeth did not conquer empires or leave heirs, but she left something greater, a story. And in that story, England found itself.